There are games that define a whole genre. And then there are games that sit awkwardly just to the left of that definition, like The Legend of Dragoon, which feels like it spent millions trying to copy Final Fantasy VII only to accidentally invent its own weirdly lovable cult classic. This is my first time playing The Legend of Dragoon. I didn't grow up with it. I didn't have nostalgia goggles on. I played it on the PlayStation 5 port in 2025 as a grown adult, fully aware that I was diving headfirst into a very late PlayStation 1 game that had mixed reviews at the time of its release. And honestly, the experience was kind of a roller coaster. The first 50% of the game had me absolutely locked in. Great pacing, cool mechanics, interesting world. Then the next 40% slowed to a crawl, and it was so tedious that I almost considered going outside for a walk, which I so desperately need to do more often. But then out of nowhere, the last 10% kicked in and I was all in again. Boss fights, lore, music, drama, ignoring my family during that epic 40-minute final boss fight. If I wasn't making this video, I may have given up midway through, but I am incredibly glad I pushed on and got to experience the whole game. My name is Mythic Vic. I review older games and we have some laughs along the way. Today, we are reviewing The Legend of Dragoon. We'll cover its ambitious development, its clunky but cool gameplay, and sometimes incredibly tedious combat system, and a story, and this is a hot take, that I prefer over Final Fantasy VII. Yes, I said it. It's more coherent, it's more consistent, and it had characters that I actually gave a damn about. Let's start with the history of this wild, expensive gamble by Sony. In the late 90s, Sony was dominating the console space, but they wanted more. They wanted a mascot JRPG, a flagship epic to rival Square's Final Fantasy VII. Enter The Legend of Dragoon, a 3-year, $16 million project by Sony Japan, which was a budget that was huge at the time. Sony threw everything they had at this game: full CGI cutscenes, pre-rendered backgrounds, a 4-disc runtime, a deep combat system, and an original fantasy world with lore thick enough to choke a chocobo. The idea was clear: make a cinematic, emotionally driven, globe-trotting RPG epic that would prove Sony could go toe-to-toe with Square. They even ended up with a development team of over 100 people, which was huge for that era. While the visuals were impressive for 1999 Japan and 2000 internationally, some cracks were obvious from the start. The localization, awful. The menu UI, kind of a war crime. Equipping a weapon took like half a day. And the pacing, well, we'll get into that soon, don't you worry. But for all of its rough edges, that ambition was undeniable. The Legend of Dragoon wasn't only trying to be the next Final Fantasy, it wanted to be the next big thing. Instead, it sort of got buried. Released the same year as other huge titles like Diablo 2 and Majora's Mask, and the looming presence of the PlayStation 2. The Legend of Dragoon ended up being that game that you maybe owned, maybe you rented it from a video game store or Blockbuster Video, or maybe you knew a friend that owned a pirated version of the game, and he would always tell you that he was going to lend it to you when he finished up playing it, but he never finished it, Mitch, I want the game. It's been over 20 years, Mitchell. But according to Wikipedia, which we all know we can trust wholeheartedly, the game sold fairly well, but even then, other than Mitch, I don't really know anyone else who played that game at all, so nah. But for a certain group of people, it hit hard, and in 2025, with the PlayStation 5 port making it more accessible than ever, it finally feels like the right time to figure out whether it was just an undercooked Final Fantasy VII clone, or something more. Now let's talk about the gameplay, because The Legend of Dragoon is pretty weird, but also sort of brilliant and a bit tedious all at the same time. Combat is turn-based, but it throws in what it calls additions. These are timed button presses that turn your basic attacks into something more like a rhythm minigame. You hit the X button right as the square collapses on the other square, and if you nail it, your character does a multi-hit combo. It's simple at first, but gets progressively harder, adding fake outs, tempo shifts, and the occasional counter attack that you need to press O to negate. Some of these attacks feel really great when you're trying to pull them off, and some of them feel like you're trying to thread a needle while you're in a car crash. And obviously practice makes perfect, and I would get better and better, and then I wouldn't play for a day or two, and then all that progress would get reset, and I had to figure it all out again. It's an interesting system because it forces engagement. You can't just mash through random battles, you've got to pay attention. It also means that you might favor weaker attacks because they are easier to pull off, and that itself is very unique. But by the 20th hour, by the 200th encounter, it starts to get pretty repetitive. But if you lose concentration for even like 1 second, your attack goes from this epic 600 points of damage to a measly 80. And then there's the Dragoon system. Every character can transform into a Dragoon, basically a magical armored form with access to big spells and flashy animations. It's hype. Maybe the first time, maybe even the first 5 times you transform. But every Dragoon transformation is locked into this mini cutscene that you can't skip. Now, luckily, the developers at the time made it so that you could turn off these Dragoon transformation mini cutscenes that take half an hour each time, but for whatever reason, they didn't apply that same capability to the attacks themselves. This, for me, is where the game gets extremely frustrating because the Dragoon spells and attacks are some of the strongest in the game. During a boss fight, it is almost expected that all 3 of your characters are in Dragoon form. Being forced to watch the same 20-second animations over and over physically hurt inside my body. It made me want to do horrible things to myself. But on top of that, you add the enemy animations. They themselves take 15 to 20 seconds each attack. And that would make some fights go for like 15 to 20 minutes. Something that is meant to feel epic on scale ends up becoming a bit of a repetitive chore. Now, you might argue that gamers aren't as patient as they used to be. It could be true. But also at the same time, you have gamers playing games like Power Wash Simulator and Minecraft when they look at a stone wall for hours while they're looking for diamonds. So we're still pretty patient. This style of gameplay where you can't skip attacks doesn't really hold up today. Now, Dragoon Attacks also uses its own timing mechanic. Instead of it being simple, you get a spinning dial you have to stop with precise timing. This is a mechanic I didn't mind, as these types of attacks were fast and the length of them scaled with how successful you were during the minigame. But that's where the mid-game sags. The combat system that felt fresh in Disc 1 becomes mechanical in Disc 3. Final Fantasy VII didn't have timed combos, but it had variety. Summons, limit breaks, materia. It had variety, and The Legend of Dragoon sort of doesn't really. But here's the kicker, I still enjoyed most of it, because there's a weird satisfaction in finally nailing a complicated addition, or watching Rose do her full Dragoon combo for the 87th time and thinking, yeah, she's still got it and she's still powerful. It's not a refined system, but it's a very memorable one. Now, I have to sort of set the scene for you for this next part. Basically, I want you to close your eyes and think of the original Pokemon games, Blue, Yellow, and red. Think about what is one of the worst parts of that game. Which section specifically drives you insane? For me, and I think many of you, it would have to be those Zubat dungeons. The constant barrage of encounters, the anxiety of a wild Zubat attacking you for the 50th time. For me, that was the feeling I had in The Legend of Dragoon. The enemy variety is top tier, but the frequency of how often you will be in a fight made me want to pull my hair out. Add the slower combat system I mentioned before, and the encounters really start to hold back on the enjoyment of this expertly created world. You will see a chest in the distance, but you know that in order to retrieve it, you have to fight 3 or 4 battles before you get there. Earlier on, I was exploring every pathway, I was finding every chest, but the more and more I played, I just sort of gave up on that whole thing and just beeline for the end of the game just so I could stop fighting monsters over and over again. But where the game was most rewarding for me was in the map exploration, was in the level design, the small puzzles that you would have to solve in order to progress to the next part of the game. Secret paths, secret caves, upside down areas in anti-gravity thingo rocks in the sky. It was awesome. Everywhere you went sort of felt like this maze that you had to solve, even though the maze that you're in, you're fighting every 3 or 4 steps. If the developers added more puzzles and less encounters, then the moment-to-moment gameplay would have felt much more rewarding. Now the story, that's where The Legend of Dragoon quietly flexes. The world is dense, you've got kingdoms at war, ancient winged civilizations, divine dragons, sealed gods, reincarnated souls. It's a very full play, and sometimes occasionally it might stumble over its own lore, but it never lacks ambition. Dart, the main character, is basically a shonen protagonist in knight's clothing. He's got the sword, the dead parents, the mysterious past. That childhood friend who's obviously in love with him, it's a bit, you know, it's a Japanese game, it's a JRPG, so it's very over the top where she would like die for him and she's like addicted to him and just wants him all the time. It's a bit weird. But what really surprised me is how quickly the story actually expands past him. Rose is a standout, mysterious, cold, tragic. She's got that late 90s energy that still hits. Lavitz is the best, like, bro. He's like your frat bro. You sort of, yeah, what's up? Yeah, he's cool. He's really cool. And then, you know, there's going to be spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, click off right now. He dies and then Albert replaces him, and he's not really a bro anymore, but he's still cool as well. Even though some characters looking at you, Maru, fall a little flat, the group dynamic works. Each of them had their own backstory, everyone was connected somehow, and most of them didn't even know it. And Lloyd, he is genuinely one of the better early JRPG antagonists. Cold, philosophical, driven by something deeper than I just want to destroy the world. When the game finally pulls the curtain back on him and ties everything together in the final act, it lands. This is where the final 10% shines. Everything that dragged in Disc 3 suddenly pays off. Emotional moments hit, character arcs close, the lore ties together, the divine dragon fight, epic! And the final boss sequence was perfect, a perfect ending to this incredibly ambitious story. And that's what I meant before when I said I think The Legend of Dragoon tells a better story than Final Fantasy VII. Yes, FF7 has iconic characters, huge moments, and a legacy that's impossible to ignore. But its story is a bit messy, and honestly, it was difficult for me to follow along to. Dragoon, on the other hand, has a very consistent tone, a world that makes sense, and a narrative that builds logically. It's more restrained, sure, but it's also more focused. And all of that helps keep the player engaged in what's happening. everything we do feels desperate and that it is possible that we might fail. And when the final credits roll, you don't just remember the moments, you understand them. That's a rare feat. And like I sort of touched on before, the world itself is incredibly well built. Each town has its own personality, its own characters that you get to know. And I was always really willing to explore and talk to every NPC in each town. So was it worth playing Legend of Dragoon in 2025? Honestly, yes. Absolutely. It's sometimes messy, it's a bit bloated, it could have been half as long and twice as good, but it's also bold, sincere, and clearly made by a team that swung for the fences, and I respect that. Now, I don't think that it ever had a chance of beating the popularity of Final Fantasy, but it did carve out its own space, and for some fans, that space was enough to make it a lifelong favorite. And having played it now, I get it, I really do. The Legend of Dragoon might not be a perfect JRPG, but it's a memorable one. And in a sea of forgotten PlayStation titles, that's a pretty damn good legacy. I'm Mythic Vic, thank you very much for watching. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. Do it. Until next time, see ya.